to the Scrutiny Performance Panel for Education. Could I welcome Jen Rayner, our Cabinet Member, and also Helen Morgan-Rees, and congratulate her on her new role as Director of Education. So really well done, and it's lovely to see you in that new role. And of course Brian Rolls, who's from the Education Department, coming along as well. So Michelle, would you like to do a roll call before we start? I always seem to forget that, and we do it about halfway through. So can we do the roll call?
Yep, certainly. We've had no apologies. So I'll go through the list. Councillor Lyndon Jones?
Yes.
Cyril Anderson? I think Cyril's here. I've seen his picture down the bottom. Mike Day?
Yeah.
Mike Dirk? Stephen Gallagher?
Yes.
David Helliwell? Bev Hopkins?
Yes.
Linda James?
Yes.
Sue Jones? Miles Langstone? Alexander Roberts? Dave Anderson Thomas?
Yes.
And Linda Tyler Lloyd.
For some reason, I couldn't unmute myself, so that's unusual. I've always got something to say.
In the Tower Ballroom.
We've also got Councillor Jennifer Rayner, Cabinet Member, Brian Roll, and Helen Morgan-Rees. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Have we received any apologies?
No apologies today.
Okay, thanks. Are there a disclosure of personal and prejudicial interests by anyone?
None that are specific, as well as general ones, because I guess as we're all governors of various schools, just a general one.
Yeah, well, yeah, yes, indeed, yeah, in that sense. Okay, anybody else? No. Right, prohibition of whip votes and declaration of party whips. And the next item is letters and minutes. Has anybody got any comments? I think silence means no. That's good. Public questions. Have we received any?
We have no public questions today.
Okay, great, fine. We've got this. We're going through the agenda at a record rate, I think. Yeah, right. The really important bit is the annual budget proposals as they relate to education matters. I know that Helen has got a presentation. So do you want to start with that, possibly, Helen?
Thank you, Chair. I'm comfortable to start on that basis if everybody else is. Okay, so we've got a very small number of slides for you this afternoon, and I'm very grateful to Michelle for taking over the screen, really, to make sure that we go through the slides as swiftly as possible. Before we go on to the next or the first slide, just for you to be aware, the slides are bilingual, so we won't be delivering our proposals through the medium of Welsh this afternoon, but they are there in terms of any public awareness around this scrutiny panel. So we will skip over the Welsh slides, but they're there for a good reason. So if we go to the first slide, Michelle, which is a Welsh one. Okay, and then on to that's the first slide in English. Okay, so this 3-slide show will provide you a little bit of context in terms of our strategy, in terms of the education budget. It should be a familiar narrative to you. It should not be something new to you this year that you haven't heard in previous years. I'm just wondering, Michelle, if you could make the presentation a little bit larger.
Sorry, struggling to do that because I've got it in.
Okay, that I'll do my best.
Sorry, I'll if you give me a minute, I can just turn it over to the. You carry on. I might swap it over to the presentation rather than the PDF. Hoping that we can.
Where to go?
Apologies. You carry on. Carry on.
Okay, I'll do my best. If I can't read every word, Brian, for some reason it's really quite small on my screen, and my monitor's not working at the moment. So, Brian, if you need to come in, I may have to ask you to come in on this slide. So, in essence, we've got a consistent medium-term education budget strategy. So, part of that strategy is to ensure, first and foremost, is that we delegate as much of the resource that comes into education, as much of that as possible to schools, and it allows then the schools to be as flexible as they can in how they use their delegated funding within their own school budgets. Secondly, we wish to prioritise pupil-specific areas of a statutory nature within the non-delegated budget. So what I'm saying there, in essence, is that the non-delegated budget in education is quite lean. It does not allow for non-statutory activity. It's very much focused on the statutory provision that must be there. Thirdly, and just to emphasise the second point really, is that we maintain an absolute core minimum for statutory and regulatory duties. So if there is any service level agreement for non-statutory activity, we do anticipate and expect a full cost recovery of any services that go beyond our statutory and regulatory duties. So for this year, in terms of the delegated amount to schools, it is a positive picture. We have an uplift in terms of cash amount of £5.3 million. Michelle, I'm not seeing anything on screen at the moment.
Sorry, I'm just trying to turn it over to a presentation rather than.
Thank you.
We can have a full slideshow.
Oh, I can see.
There we are. There we are. That's better, isn't it?
Wonderful. Yes. If we go to slide, that's
Perfect.
back one. Oh, sorry. That's the right one. Yeah, that's fine. Sorry. Okay. So just to say, it's a positive picture in terms of the delegation of funding to schools for 2021-2022 financial year. So it is a cash uplift of £5.3 million, or percentage-wise 3.3% in terms of the delegated budget. So that's a positive additional amount. In addition to that, there's more investment in terms of a 10-year plan for infrastructure, in terms of ensuring that the plans we've put in place now for additional devices and kit, not just in light of COVID, but pre-COVID plans, that those plans are sustainable and maintained over a 10-year period. So that equates to £7 million over 10 years and at no extra cost to schools. So again, that presents us with a very positive picture. Also, the continued investment in terms of having the right schools in the right places at the right time as part of the Band B capital programme is there as well, and at no extra cost to schools. Additionally, we have the capital maintenance investment of £3 million going forward to the new financial year. Again, that's a positive picture. For the pressures that were on the non-delegated budget in education, we were anticipating potentially more pressure in terms of a pay rise, but those pressures have been reduced because of the UK government's pay freeze. So that means that the pressures we did anticipate haven't been realised going forward. And the final point, the penultimate point there is that we have additional targeted funding in the non-delegated budgets to reflect some of the other pressures we have in education, which are sometimes demographic, service specific, and result in demand being increased, and a good example of that would be additional learning needs. And finally then, on the first slide, obviously we have, as I said right at the outset, we have a medium-term financial plan. We have a strategy in education, so we don't set a budget year upon year in a vacuum. It's very much part of our strategy. And those medium-term financial plan targets are there to be realised. And obviously sometimes it's easier to meet those targets and make efficiencies. But in times like COVID, where we have an extraordinary year in terms of our financial pressures and how we control those pressures, obviously it's not always easy. So if we go to the next slide, and I think Brian is going to introduce that, and then I'll come back to the third slide, and then we'll start to take questions, if that's okay.
That's great, thank you.
All right. One more. Thank you. Oh, yeah, perfect. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you, Helen. Yes, obviously the next question that jumps to mind from that first slide is, well, that's very good and that's very positive in terms of a cash increase. But what does it actually mean for what does it actually mean for the delegated schools budget? And this is what this slide tries to show, really. So that 5.3%, 5.3 million cash increase is more than sufficient to cover the basic pay, anticipated pay, and other cost pressures that would be facing schools in the coming year, as well as some mainstream additional learning needs pressures that are in the system. But then more than that, it's more than sufficient to cover some of the additional costs that we anticipate in respect of some service level agreements, where there are some externally driven cost factors which will affect the cost of those services. And as I say, that will ensure that schools will have more than sufficient additional funding to meet those costs increases that they will face in the coming year. In addition to that, the additional funding is also sufficient to enable us to target some additional funding within the funding formula to meet and support some of our wider education reviews, particularly around additional learning needs and specialist teaching facilities and so on. It's always helpful when you've got transformative strategies to be able to ensure that there is the same injection of funding to support the delivery of those strategies, and particularly, of course, we've got the implications of the ALN Act here. So all of that is encouraging, because it's a further enhancement of the actual mainstream capacity within schools. It maximises, as Helen touched on in the previous slide, the flexibility that schools have to actually determine their own spending priorities and to meet all pupil needs, as well as their core responsibilities around things like premises maintenance and so on. We have always believed in maximising the amount of funding that goes directly into schools, and that in this budget as well, we continue to give schools that ownership and the flexibility that they need to determine their own spending priorities. Now clearly, since the bulk of the funding is going directly into schools' delegated budgets, we are expecting schools to continue to support the local authority services through the service level agreements, as well as obviously continuing to deliver and meet their core statutory responsibilities and things like premises maintenance and so on, with that additional funding that is being provided. Now, we'd love to have a kind of a multi-year kind of budget, but we're not in the luxury of that position, and particularly not in the current circumstances. So this is inevitably a one-year offer, and future year's budget proposals are obviously going to take account of how the additional funding that has been provided this year has actually been used by schools. So if we could move on, Michelle, to the final slide, please.
Thank you, Brian. One thing we should have mentioned really at the outset is our statutory school budget forum has an opportunity really to respond to our proposals, and we did receive a response to our proposals this week, and indeed it was a very constructive reply in terms of that close collaboration with our schools as our key stakeholders in our budget planning processes. They've very much thought that this was a constructive opportunity to work with us, and they saw it as a favourable proposal for the financial year for delegation of funds to schools. Okay, so this is the final slide, and this really emphasises that we do have those medium-term financial savings plans, and inevitably we have to make efficiencies. We can't, you know, after 10 years of austerity, we can't continue to spend in the way we have, and we have to seek ways of effectively managing our budget and seeking opportunities to save as much as possible. So the first one there reflects really the current ongoing negotiations around the future of regional improvement services. Currently we're part of our consortium ERO, but we would always seek to make efficiencies in terms of our contribution to the central model, and indeed going forward we have more flexibility potentially around what we can select that the region delivers on our behalf or deselect accordingly. So there's an opportunity there to make efficiencies. In terms of home to school transport, again we need to continue the nature and the spread of that provision across the city and county of Swansea, and to further mitigate any demand and cost pressures, particularly in additional learning needs. So again, we've quantified our targets really in terms of making those efficiencies. The school meal price increase in September 2021 to reflect a cost pressure there. So obviously that income would be of benefit in terms of managing our non-delegated budget. Reducing pupil mobility, again, early delivery of savings from a new service model, which we are currently looking at options around how we can deliver that effectively. Out of county placements in the field of additional learning needs, obviously very costly. We want to ensure that the provision comes within Swansea as much as possible. So again, mitigation against those demands, increasing demands and cost pressures, and the spend really, that we're spending a lot of money outside of Swansea, and we'd much prefer to have that provision brought in closer to home. There are further challenging targets that also reflect other external cost pressures. So the recovery of additional externally driven cost pressures in catering and cleaning from schools, so an increase there. So that's more than covered really by the proposed delegated cash increase. So we would see an increase to the cost of schools that would come back into the centre. And final point there is that obviously the review and demand of cost pressures that still require even tighter mitigating actions to replace the existing savings targets. And some of these have been undeliverable against the timescales that were set originally. So some of those undeliverable targets, according to the timescales, have been one was the creation of an additional walking route, and secondly, a further increase in school meal prices back in April 2020. So obviously we were hit there in terms of our ability to bring that income because of COVID. So in a nutshell, that provides us, thank you, Michelle, really grateful for sharing the slides, and I'm glad I could see them in the end. So that provides a context really for where we are, where we normally operate in terms of our strategy. And I am aware that we've had some questions that Linda Taylor-Lloyd has provided to myself, which are not necessarily related to the budget per se. So I don't know if you want to cover those questions off straight away with Councillor Tyler Lloyd, and then go on to questions in relation to the budget planning in terms
I think should we do the budget first, because I think that's the main purpose, and we've got a bit of a limited time in this meeting.
That's fine. We'll come back to those.
Could we use the hands up facility for the questions? And I can see we've got one hand up, and that's a number of hands up already. But Al was the first. Al Roberts.
Thanks, Chair, and apologies for being late to the meeting earlier on, a bit of a PC problem. Thank you for the budget presentation, very helpful. Just two questions. One, the first one, you mentioned full cost recovery, I think on the first slide, Helen. And I just wondered how that relates to incurred COVID costs that schools have this year. And how that conversation is going with Welsh Government, because I understand the challenges that you set out earlier in the year around, will we see that money? Are we likely to see that money? And how that relates to this budget report. And my second question is really just about the accountability of the budget spend at the bottom of that slide, and what your plans are that might be beyond what would be normal record keeping in order to evidence that spend, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Roberts. I'll make an attempt to answer, then I'll bring Brian Rose in if I need to in terms of technical assurance to the answer. So the first question in terms of full cost recovery in relation to the first slide was very much about our service level agreements, and that is a requirement of the Council that full cost recovery against service level agreements is always met. So indeed, the hardship fund that you referred to is very much a separate issue. It's very much a COVID issue. It's not in relation to the budget setting process. Obviously, the questions around the sustainability of that hardship fund is a key question, but it's obviously not in relation to this budget setting process. And then the last point, the second point you made in terms of the last point on the first slide, in terms of accountability and evidence, can I just ask for clarification, Councillor Roberts, on what exactly the point is and what you need evidence on? Sorry.
It would be useful to see the slide because I'm only trying to remember it as well. But it talked about the fact that you will be closely monitoring the spend that schools are making against the additional funds that they're receiving, to make sure that I think that they were spending the money wisely. I think that was the gist of it, but without being able to see the exact wording, I'm only sort of paraphrasing at the moment. But I just wondered how you're going to do it. Yeah, is it something that you mentioned that you're going to do it? Is that because it's something that you wouldn't normally do, or is this an extraordinary activity, or is this something that you wouldn't that you would be doing anyway? So.
Okay, I'll bring Brian in.
Sorry,
in terms of how we monitor.
I can have a crack at that. I mean, the basic point there is the fact that we've got a medium-term education budget strategy, which we've been rolling out and delivering on for not many years, as you know, and we've always sought to put as much resource as possible directly into the delegated schools budget to give as much flexibility as possible to schools. Now, clearly, what that means is that we really are tight on the non-delegated budget because we are not holding anything back that isn't core statutory need and so on, and that leaves that very tight. So really there's nowhere kind of to go if schools aren't sort of meeting the needs for which we are providing that resource. There's nowhere really else for us to kind of look. And so the only point that was being made in the slide really was the fact that that the other side of the reverse side of the coin is that for giving schools the maximum flexibility and funding, we clearly have to look to ensure that they are meeting those responsibilities that they have for which we've given them that funding. And the point really was that we're not in the luxury of a position where we've got a 3-year council funding settlement to enable us to have a multi-year delegated schools budget settlement. So that was the point that we're trying to make, really, is that we've clearly got to see how we go through this coming year, and then that will inform future discussions on the budget, I'm sure, Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Thank you, Brian. But really, the point I'm getting at is that, you know, it suggests that you're monitoring it. Maybe I read too much into it, but you'll be monitoring how that delegated spend is being spent, and that if it's not being spent in the right way, is there some kind of sanction? I mean, what is that monitoring process? If you look at it and go, well, wait a minute, what was this? How much challenge goes back to the schools on that, please?
Well, we don't kind of prescribe how schools utilise the funding that they receive. Clearly, that is the whole benefit of the delegated schools budget, is that schools are best placed to determine their own spending priorities. But we have to, because we've got a statutory provision, of course, clearly we've got to be clear that pupils' needs are being met. And so it's not in the sense of kind of how are you spending it pound by pound. It's what impact is that having? Are pupils' needs being met? And in terms of the fact that we are putting as much resource into the delegated budget as we are, clearly we want to see that the strategy, the wider education strategy to enhance further the capacity of schools within mainstream provision to meet those needs of all pupils. We want to see that those strategies are working. So that's the level that the monitoring is going to be at, and clearly if we're delivering on that, that's brilliant, and we can continue with our medium-term financial strategy, which puts more resource in as far as possible into schools directly. Did that kind of help?
I understand what you're telling me, but it doesn't sound like that there is any, other than just keeping an eye on how schools are spending money, it doesn't sound like there is any action that ensues from that monitoring of how schools are spending their money. The expectation is that schools are always spending money in the best interests of their pupils. And if that's the case, then I just wonder why it was put on the slide, that's all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al. And Brian. Next question, Councillor Miles Langston.
Thanks, Lyndon. I've got a couple of questions, but I'll just go with one, and then obviously we can come back. I don't want to sort of be asking loads of questions at once. But just in terms of the general context of this, obviously there's got to be cost savings and everything associated with that. Now, I know in 2019 there was an uplift in education spending at a UK government level, which resulted in 1.24 billion going to Welsh Government as a result in terms of extra education funding. I wrote to the Finance Minister at the time, who accepted that was the case, but didn't necessarily commit to whether all that money would be going into education or whatever else. As you understand, then how the Welsh Government spends any funding that comes in is down to them. It was just a question: how much does Swansea receive as a result of that additional funding, and what sort of impact has that made?
Chair, I'm not in a position to answer that question myself. I don't know if anybody else is, and if we can't, we'll have to come back to you, Councillor Langston. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Is anybody?
I mean, what I can say.
Could I come in here? Sorry, is that it doesn't actually come down from the Welsh Government in little boxes saying this is your highways, this is your education. It comes down to local authority grant, and there is a lot of guidance, but there's a lot of local provision which is being made. I'm sure by now you'll have had the opportunity to read the findings of the review into schools financing, which came out just before Christmas. Now, if I could just elaborate, there seems to be some missing gaps in some of these questions. As school governors, you will be aware that your budget is discussed with your support officer, how it's divvied up. And you will get clear sheets, especially if you're members of the Finance Committee, with all the headings of what is going on, and you get quarterly updates with your finance officers. Your schools will also be visited by challenge advisors who will be looking at the educational impact of the spends in those areas. The schools will also be party to a premises management arrangement where surveyors will come in and just check up on what work has been progressed. And behind that, of course, these budgets are not allocated just by Helen, myself and Brian, a small team. We have a big co-production network, fashionable word, but we've been doing it for years, a primary support team and secondary support, and also premises, which are made up of head teachers all meeting together to analyse what is happening to the budgets generally. So for us to say to Miles, we can go away and look it up, or we can ask Ben Smith, the actual sum that comes down the road earmarked education is really not how local government funding is allocated.
Okay, great, thanks. Miles, do you have another question, or do you want to come in later? You're on
the other question is related to the basically with the transport and savings around the transport and potential routes there. Is there any more detail on where that is being made, what sort of transport links are being created, and how that sort of saving plays into sort of the reality in terms of basically how you're going to make that work?
Yeah, I'll come back in initially. Obviously, if there are elements that are under consideration and not in the public domain yet, so I can't comment fully on some of the detail. But what I would say is that we are working on options that have been appraised through a series of workshops internally by officers, and that will enable us potentially to go late spring to Cabinet to seek permission to consult. So we're at that stage so far. In terms of making efficiencies with transport, I think every penny counts. So it is about close controls really on any decisions that we make. So one small decision can cost us for 7 years. An example is additional learning needs transport, where it's not always necessary to provide that transport. And if we ask some discerning questions right at the start of the process, then we can avoid unnecessary costs. But historically, I think we've been offering ALN transport as an example where it's not always needed, and we've had to bear that cost for a number of years. So that's an easy efficiency really to ensure that we're asking the right questions right to the point of offering that transport. So in terms of our specialist teaching facilities across Swansea, obviously we have more than 30 attached to our mainstream schools. So what we do is transport children from one side of the city to the other side, whereas potentially they could be educated closer to home. So that's one example where we could look to make things better for the children, and efficiencies as a secondary to making things better for the children. But I think in terms of the larger big ticket items, in terms of sending children out of county and the large transport costs associated with those in terms of ALN, I think we need to consider really our specialist places in Swansea. And there will be a paper going to Cabinet in March that will explore that issue in terms of increasing our specialist places here in Swansea to keep our learners close to home and to avoid these unnecessarily long journeys for them, and also the large bills of transport that come with that.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Helen. Councillor Mike Day. Mike.
Thank you, Chair. I think if we could split down the budget into capital and revenue. First of all, I'm extremely pleased to see the investment that's going into school buildings, and I think it's fantastic that the £150 million is going in. And I know that's due to a number of factors, for example, Welsh Government funding, but also the council being able to benefit from the lower interest rates as well. And I really welcome that. I'm sure everybody would be totally supportive of the initiatives to improve our school estates. The second thing then is that if we look at the revenue budget, some of the questions I have, which would be sort of fairly minor, when you're talking about £167 million revenue budget, some of the figures pale into insignificance. But what I wanted to do was to try and look at how those impact upon schools and potentially parents and pupils. So the first thing is, Brian, I know we had discussions in times gone by about, so what is the percentage of the budget, which is delegated. I'm not asking for a question, an answer to the question now, but maybe Brian could come back to us and just let us know, how that figure is progressing. The second point is a more general one, is given the uncertain nature of the future, how flexible are we going to be with schools in terms of the reserves? I know that we got the guidelines of 5%, but I know that a number of schools are saying, well, they don't really know at the moment how things are going to shape up, where money is going to come from in the future. And I'm not suggesting that we should be draconian in any way, but there is a need for us to make sure that resources are being used for the benefit of the pupils, which I think we've discussed previously. So it's just that general question. Specific question then in relation to the school meal prices. What does that mean in terms of the cost, the increase for individual school meal for pupils? How does that sort of translate into where we are now and what the additional cost would be? And I suppose related to that is obviously there would be some parents and pupils who would not be in a position to afford it. So, what are the measures that we can use to mitigate that? And the last point I wanted to raise, apart from welcoming the move away from out-of-county placements, I think, as long as we've got the quality provision, I think we should be moving towards that as quickly as we can, and, would encourage and support that. The other question I had then was in relation to just a heading in the budgets and the savings proposals, and just for any parents who may be listening into this particular discussion, the heading says reducing pupil mobility. I know that there's a concern that how that would be interpreted in terms of whether that would actually be reducing parental choice in relation to where pupils go. I think we all know that that's not the case, but it'd be useful just to kind of confirm that that's the situation. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'll make a start and then I'll probably bring Brian in with some of the technical questions. Obviously, I don't know if Brian does know the proportion in terms of the non-delegated, delegated budget. You do? Oh, excellent.
Yes. Yeah. In the current year, i.e. 2021, 83.8% is the delegation rate, the published one by the Welsh Government. If you take transport out of that, if you just bear with me a moment, I can tell you. If you take homeschool transport out of that, it's 87.6%. The figure would be for Swansea, and that's slightly higher than the Wales average. So those are the figures there, which obviously the figures haven't been produced, finalised for next financial year. So I can't give you that, obviously.
Okay, thank you, Brian. In terms of the challenge around school reserves, obviously historically Swansea has been very proactive in challenging the use of those school reserves. Less so this year, probably because of an extraordinary year that we faced with COVID, and I think that's quite right and proper, really. We have had some very fruitful and productive discussions with schools in the past, I'm aware of, where schools have been able to explain quite plainly why their reserves appeared high. I think our biggest concerns have been with schools with 3 years worth of reserves exceeding 10%, and that has been a key concern of ours that we would continue to monitor post-COVID times. So I think that's fair from my position. Brian, do you want to add anything in terms of challenging schools on their reserves?
No, I mean, this is. No, exactly as you say. This is an odd time all round, isn't it? So, I mean, it's not really the time to be doing that. Schools need that flexibility that the reserves actually enables them to have.
Okay, and then turning to the cost of school meals, Brian, do you want to come in and explain really where we are and what the increases mean?
Yes, it was approved a year ago, actually, the September, this coming September increase, and so it's not a decision for this budget. It was made in the last budget, which was a 10p increase to £2.50, I think, if I remember it rightly. So basically, then the medium-term financial plan that has other regular annual reviews of the meals price, because clearly if food costs rise, clearly we need to reflect that in terms of the actual charge to for meals. Obviously we've got those that are entitled to free school meals aren't paying that increased price anyway. So does that cover that point?
Great, thank you, Brian. I was impressed that you knew the delegated figures very quickly there, but knowing you, I know that you would. So very good. And questions from anyone? Any other questions? I know we're going to come back to Linda. I've got one if we haven't just yet, and that is with regard to Eru. Obviously, the footprint is likely to change. I don't know where we are with that. We've got a scrutiny meeting on that shortly. But how is that likely to affect the budget? Because obviously, we'll be talking about, involved with different authorities, so we may find that our responsibilities slightly change or whatever.
Yeah, just to say that in the current financial year, our obligation in terms of contributing to the central costs of Eru are to the tune of £150,000 per annum. And that was a significant hike in comparison to the previous financial year, where it sat at around £69,000. So going forward, we have the opportunity really to work with other authorities within the City Deal footprint, potentially. Those conversations are ongoing. And there's an opportunity to make a lesser contribution because we would be very discerning in itemising what we want the region to deliver and what we don't want it to deliver. So an example of that would be potentially that we would have less of a central team in the new consortium arrangement in our part of the world. And we could face a scenario where Swansea delivers some of the school improvement work itself and then depends on the region to do other school improvement work. So it's a mixed picture. But by doing that and selecting and deselecting what we want and what we don't want, then we can be more efficient really in our contribution. So I think there's an opportunity. It's a very complex landscape at the moment, but there's an opportunity there for the future. And we've surveyed our schools to ask them really what they want the consortium to deliver on their behalf. And they've been very clear in telling us and giving us clear messages about what's good, what's not so good, and what they think they can do between schools or utilising existing officers within Swansea.
Thank you, Helen. Obviously, with the new footprint, you can look at things differently. I think the current organisation decided in the last year or two to take on central staff, and that probably upped the budget quite considerably, and not sort of using staff in or asking staff in existing roles in councils to take on some of that work. But that will be interesting to see how that actually plays out, because obviously that's a huge increase from 69 to 150, and obviously we need to see, because it has an impact obviously on the budget, because the more money they spend, the less money we've got to spend in Swansea. And I appreciate that some of the work that they'll be doing is some of the things that we would otherwise be doing. So great, thanks for that. And I look forward to the Eru scrutiny meeting to see where we are with it. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, can I ask Linda? You had some questions.
Yes, this is strange really, because I went out with the dog just before this meeting and I bumped Kath Boyce. You know Kath Boyce, she sends her best wishes to Helen and congratulations on the new job as well. And I said, I've got to go back because I've got this education scrutiny committee. So she said, bum, 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 bum. These are the questions I want you to ask. So these are the questions. And I think that from your report, I think that you probably covered a lot of these questions, but can I just read them out anyway, in case you've missed out anything that I can return, because I've been making notes frantically. One, has the cost of safety been factored in? Is extra funding for staff needed at this time of COVID sustainable? Is the funding for new curriculum expenditure available? Is the pupil deprecation grant keeping up at this time? Are schools being guided with new conditions to keep staff and students safe? Best wishes and congratulations to Helen. So I think that you have probably covered a lot of this, but I'm wondering whether with this budget, are the schools expected to fund their own extra staff that they've got in for looking after the children? Is that coming under this money that's being allocated to the school?
The questions and the answers really sit very much outside the budget proposals because they come from the hardship fund.
Right.
So any additional cost really can be claimed for potentially from this hardship fund, but only if a school can demonstrate that it's unavoidable, it's additional and it's absolutely necessary. So we have heard this week that the foundation phase staff, when they go back next week, that there will be an opportunity to cover the cost of planning, preparation and assessment time in a school by asking some TAs potentially to increase their duties or have additional hours, and that can be claimed for from the hardship fund. So a lot of the questions then in terms of the cost of safety being factored in, again, that's outside the normal budget process, and it's additional things like safety measures, I would say face coverings. They're funded from a number of sources. So we've heard that the Welsh Local Government Association is providing a Pan Wales £5 million award of funding really to ensure that enhanced or upgraded face coverings are available to schools, all schools, not just those primary schools with foundation phase pupils coming back. So this very much sits outside the budget process itself. In terms of the new curriculum, obviously Brian mentioned when we were talking about the budget proposals, he mentioned the flexibility within delegated amounts to cover the cost of ALN. So we know that ALN reform in Wales is actually being implemented this September, so it's within the proposed financial year. But for the new curriculum, that implementation doesn't start until 2022. So we'll have to see really what additional costs may come. But you know, at the moment, I can't envisage that this will present schools with a huge bill in terms of delivering the new curriculum, particularly primary schools, because they're doing much of that type of work already. And then your fourth question on the pupil development grant, as far as we know, the amount of the main pupil development grant is still £1,050, and the pupil development grant from recollection in terms of forward planning for the scrutiny panel is one of the next items in scrutiny in March. So maybe we can explore it fully during that panel meeting if that's okay with panel members. And then in terms of the guidance around new conditions to keep students and staff safe, yes, we've revised our risk assessments in Swansea according to you know, the new variants around COVID. So all of that is in hand, just to give you some reassurance. That's been done and was issued to our schools at 20 to 2 last Friday afternoon.
Great, thank you, Helen. Thank you, Linda. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Jen has got a hand up.
Yes, just to confirm that last question, are schools being guided with new conditions to keep staff, students safe? Yes. As a school governor, I've already seen the new risk assessments which came out after the local authority swiftly redid them for the new foundation phase. I think every school governor will probably be seeing those at least by Monday, with the option to get back to the school and ask questions. But I think the matter is in hand. We had very little planning time for this return, bearing in mind there is the half-term holiday. And quite rightly, the Welsh Government Director of Education said staff deserve and must take a holiday. So I think we'll be seeing happy faces going back into schools with new risk assessments, and possibly more bills going to hardship funds, because one of the issues that has just sort of started floating up, we've been wiping down desks so frequently and tables and toys with strong disinfectant that we're going to have to start replacing those because they're starting to delaminate.
All right. Gosh. Yeah.
So do take care. And equally, I know that schools have been monitored on just what they've been using, because the best thing is soap and water washing. Now, there were a few schools who were, heaven knows what they were doing with hand wash, but they were getting through that as if it was dread to think. So yeah, we're on the case, but it is constantly being upgraded. And can I thank not just the education department here, but also our health and safety teams as well, and HR, who've also been responding to a number of questions from staff who feel they must continue shielding. So it's not a process you can do just by throwing a switch. It's quite complicated, and it's a lot of help from outside of the education department, whole council working as a positive team.
Great, thanks. I've certainly seen that guidance, because I think Gal and I can say we had it sent to us by the school. So yes, certainly as a governor, I've seen that, which is important. Great. Any other questions? No. Right. Great. Thank you all very much. The next item on the agenda is summarising views for feedback to Cabinet. Any points people would like to make?
Do you want us to leave so you can have this conversation in private?
Okay, no, fine, yeah, no, if that's fine, yeah, absolutely, if you like, yeah.
Thanks. I'll
you can have a surprise then in the Cabinet, you see, so it's always nice to have a surprise.
Will we be seeing you, Lyndon, will we be seeing you on Thursday, or will it be coming through the Scrutiny?
It'll be coming up, meeting tomorrow morning, actually, yes, where I'm taking the views of this committee to the meeting in the morning.
Lovely.
Chris Holly will be coming. Chris Holly will come to Cabinet.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Right, there we go. Right. The next thing is then summarising the views to go to Cabinet. Who wants to kick off?
Can I start just by the comments I made earlier? I think we all generally accept the and welcome the capital spend and also the uplift in the revenue budget. So that would be my starting point, that we welcome that in terms of what difference that will make for our schools and pupils.
Okay. I think one of the things that I've asked in the past actually is the fact when we talk about COVID is that not all schools were open. Some schools were open, a lot of schools were not. And the schools that were open obviously had increased costs. It's obvious that they would have an increased cost and for doing the right thing. And not that they complained in any way. I know that I'm on the governing body of a school that was open, and we're pleased to be able to do that. But nevertheless, I think we should look at how those costs are going to be met, because it's unfair that they should be, if you like, be penalised for doing the right thing. And I think schools across Swansea that remained open, that should be recognised, and if possible, then they should be refunded for those costs. And I think we need to sort of raise that, because a lot of that money we can get back, because obviously the Welsh Government have been given a big budget to pay for COVID, and we want a bit of it, really, and Swansea wants a bit of it.
That's exactly, Lyndon. That hardship fund, you know, quite what the status of the applications of that hardship fund. I understand completely the challenges that Helen and the rest of the directorate have in trying to move that conversation forward. And, you know, it's not over. But just to have some clarity on the position would be good on that score. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah. Who's coming in next?
The only other thing I wanted to add was just that I think that, you know, this has been a bit of a, I call it a Narnia year, you know, everything's gone to sleep. And we're not sure what the issues are really that are likely to come out of it. And the fact that there has been a pay freeze at central government, and this is taking the pressure off funds and the delegated budget. What planning for when things start getting back to normal is taking place? Is that an unreasonable expectation from us? Is that even our place to ask that question? But it sounds like there may well be challenges ahead that aren't being factored into forward planning. I know that Brian said we don't have a 3-year plan. 3-year budget, but do we have a 3-year plan would be my question.
Yeah, okay, I'm just making a note. But yeah, okay, and you know, obviously that has a cost implication. I raised the issue about Eru because the footprint is likely to change. It currently is, well, Neath Talbot have pulled out currently of the existing arrangement, and it's Swansea, Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire, Ceredigion and Powys. And they took a decision to employ staff. And obviously, if that is the case, those staff, if that body is disappearing and it becomes 2 bodies or whatever, there will be implications for that decision. I will tell you that the first meeting I went to must be about 2 years ago. I remember saying that it was like a basket case because it just was not fit for purpose. And if you saw some of the things that were going on, it was absolute nightmare. So we shall see what we've got actually a meeting shortly, a scrutiny meeting for Eru. So it'll be interesting to see what comes up there. But obviously that does have financial implications for Swansea. If in 1 year the budget went up from 69,000 to 150,000, you know, there will be cost implications for the staffing element of that. How are we going to extract ourselves from that current system and so on, and their property that they lease and so on? So there will be costs, and you know, whether that would be met by Welsh Government or it's, you know, Swansea has to pay its part. But I think that is something we needs to be factored into the budget in some way. And obviously, possibly the cabinet may know a little more about that than obviously we do. Okay. We obviously got the points that, and Michelle has been busily writing some notes. Any other points that you'd like included? No. Okay. Well, if that's the case, I say we've got the notes from the meeting because Michelle has been busily writing there, so we'll include those in that. The only other thing on the agenda was the work programme. Our next meeting is on the 18th of March.
I've got a little update on that, Lyndon, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
First thing to update you is that the next meeting on the 18th of March, we have, I think Lyndon has arranged this, we have 4 pupils and head teacher from Bishopston Primary School to come and give feedback on blended and remote learning, to do a little feedback session on how they feel it's working for them. So that should be a really nice little session with involving pupils basically. And then for the next meeting in April, I've added the education response to the pandemic that you agreed to look at some point in the future. So I'll put that on that agenda if that's okay.
Any comments, anyone? I will say that the 4 pupils from Bishopston Primary, I chair one of the committees there, People and Community Committee, and we invited these pupils to have their say, if you like. And it was quite extraordinary what they thought. But I want you know, they can tell you themselves. But it was really interesting to listen to what they had to say rather than what we think they should say or what they think. And I have to say they were very vocal as well. So really, really well done on their part. Okay, great. Well, fine. Thank you all very much, and we will see you on the 18th of March, if not many times before. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll stop recording now.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.